Few people are aware today that the history of the United States, since the Revolution in 1776, has been, in large part, the story of an epic struggle to get free, and stay free, of control by the European international banks. This struggle was finally lost in 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson signed into effect the Federal Reserve Act, putting the international banking cartel in charge of creating America's money. Paul Grignon, Money as Debt. Thomas Jefferson mentioned the nefarious power of the bankers directly, saying desperately, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution, taking from the federal government the power of borrowing." After Alexander Hamilton's gang had established the Federal Bank, and the judiciary with its unlimited power, Jefferson's illusions concerning America's fate were gone. In 1821, 5 years before he died, he recorded his misgivings and foreboding. "It has long been my opinion that the germ of dissolution of our federal judiciary is in the constitution of the federal judiciary, an irresponsible body working like gravity by night and by day, gaining a little today and a little tomorrow, and advancing its noiseless step like a thief over the field of jurisdiction, until all shall be usurped from the states, and the government of all be consolidated into one. To this I am opposed, because when all government shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and will become as venal and oppressive as the government from which we separated. Our government is now taking so steady a course as to show by what road it will pass to destruction, to wit, by consolidation first, and then corruption, its necessary consequences." Thomas Jefferson. Along with William Paterson, Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams, he put states' rights before the demands of insatiable Federalists. The following year, Jefferson's insight sharpened all the more. His words reveal the accuracy of his foresight: "If ever this vast country is brought under a single government, it will be one of the most extensive corruption." In fact, Jefferson had misgivings about the state of affairs in America many years before he wrote these words. He had been living in France, as minister to that country, between the years 1784 and 1789. Upon his return to America, he was horrified to see how little effect the grand precepts and provisos of the Declaration of Independence, which he had chiefly formulated, had made. Alfred J. Nock explains, on arriving in New York and resuming his place in the social life of the country, he was greatly depressed by the discovery that the principles of the Declaration had gone wholly by the board. No one spoke of natural rights and popular sovereignty. It would seem actually that no one had ever heard of them. On the contrary, everyone was talking about the pressing need of a strong central coercive authority, able to check the incursions which the democratic spirit was likely to incite upon the men of principle and property. Clearly, though the Declaration might have been the Charter of American Independence, it was in no sense the Charter of the new American state. Our enemy, the state. Patrick Henry, longtime critic of the Constitution's drafters, also clearly foresaw the totalitarianism of the Federalists. "My great objection to this government is, that it does not leave us the means of defending our rights, or of waging war against tyrants. Have we the means of resisting disciplined armies, when our only defense, the militia, is put into the hands of Congress?" Speech of 5 June 1788. Did you ever read of any revolution in any nation, brought about by the punishment of those in power, inflicted by those who had no power at all? Will your mace-bearer be a match for a disciplined regiment? Will the oppressor ever let go of the oppressed? Was there ever an instance? Can the annals of mankind exhibit one single example, where rulers, overcharged with power, willingly let go of the oppressed? Ibid. A standing army we shall have also, to execute the execrable commands of tyranny. Ibid. Alfred J. Nock summarizes the travesty and the tragedy in these words: "Nowhere in the history of the constitutional period do we find the faintest suggestion of the Declaration's doctrine of natural rights, and we find its doctrine of popular sovereignty not only continuing in abeyance, but constitutionally estopped from ever reappearing. Nowhere do we find a trace of the Declaration's theory of government. On the contrary, we find it expressly repudiated. The new political mechanism was a faithful replica of the old disestablished British model, but so far improved and strengthened as to be incomparably more close-working and efficient, presenting more attractive possibilities of capture and control. Our enemy, the state. Nothing that governments do is new. Despots within government operate according to plans that are repeated, in various ways, over generations. Their control is aided and abetted by their co-conspirators in the media. The politicians and media spin doctors are instructed by overlords who control the private banks and philanthropic foundations. Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment nothing can fail. Without it nothing can succeed. He who molds opinion is greater than he who enacts laws. Abraham Lincoln. In many cases, the politicians, media men, and bankers are themselves under the tutelage and direction of British and European aristocracy who have made the board, so to speak, on which the great geopolitical games are played. Note the Masonic colors of Mars tie. The conspirators who organize the game are cautious. They do not want their true allegiances or diabolical schemes to be publicly exposed. Each group and individual conspirator knows how vulnerable they are. They know the facts about their true allegiances and agendas must never leak out to the masses at large. Their success depends upon human apathy and ignorance. In Red Dusk and the Morrow, by Sir Paul Dukes, formerly chief of the British Secret Service in Russia, we read that a Lithuanian asked a prominent Bolshevik how the regime was maintained. The answer was, our power is based on three things: first, on Jewish brains; secondly, on Lettish and Chinese bayonets; and thirdly, on the crass stupidity of the Russian people. Denis Fahay, the rulers of Russia. The elitist conspirators also know that should civil unrest occur, the masses can be forced back into line by threats to their material and emotional security. The strategy is tried and true, and usually works wonders. As Ernest Hemingway explained, the first panacea for a mismanaged nation is inflation of the currency, the second is war. Both bring a temporary prosperity and both bring a permanent ruin. But both are the refuge of political and economic opportunists. The Trinity of Slavery. The basic diagram shows how the Atonist royals have maintained world control for millennia. By way of theology and politics is the human heart and mind enslaved. Through secret societies, such as Masonry, the royal hierarchy of control is perpetuated and monitored. As French poet Charles Péguy wrote, tyranny is always better organized than freedom. Because of the confessions and evidence provided by intelligent and informed whistleblowers from within religion, politics, royalty, and Masonry, we know a great deal about how the engines of world control operate. However, there are also pitfalls when insiders with myopic insight, and inflexible allegiances and prejudices, attempt to instruct the masses as to the intricacies of world control. When it comes to exposing the dirty little secrets, and the dirty big secrets, of those occupying the highest levels of the Atonist power pyramid, objectivity is essential. Photographs of their hideous visages, taken from a rickety platform constructed by their agents, will be blurred and inadequate, to say the least. The philosopher Ayn Rand frequently warned her readers of the evils of big government. With great lucidity, she wrote, instead of being a protector of man's rights, the government is becoming their most dangerous violator. Instead of guarding freedom, the government is establishing slavery. Instead of protecting men from the initiators of physical force, the government is initiating physical force and coercion in any manner and issue it pleases. Instead of serving as the instrument of objectivity in human relationships, the government is creating a deadly subterranean reign of uncertainty and fear. Instead of protecting men from injury by whim, the government is arrogating to itself the power of unlimited whim, so that we are fast approaching the stage of the ultimate inversion, the stage where the government is free to do anything it pleases, while the citizens may act only by permission, which is the stage of the darkest periods of human history, the stage of rule by brute force. Rand laid it on the line when addressing the crimes of government: criminals are a small minority in any age or community. And the harm they have done to mankind is infinitesimal when compared to the horrors, the bloodshed, the wars, the persecution, the famines, the enslavements, the wholesale destruction, perpetrated by mankind's governments. Potentially, a government is the most dangerous threat to man's rights. When unlimited and unrestricted by individual rights, a government is men's deadliest enemy. Before her perceptive words were written, the French philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon explained the people versus government problem as follows: to be governed is to be watched, inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, checked, estimated, valued, censured, commanded, by creatures who have neither the right nor the wisdom nor the virtue to do so. To be governed is to be at every operation, at every transaction noted, registered, counted, taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assessed, licensed, authorized, admonished, prevented, forbidden, reformed, corrected, punished. It is, under pretext of public utility, and in the name of the general interest, to be placed under contribution, drilled, fleeced, exploited, monopolized, extorted from, squeezed, hoaxed, robbed, then, at the slightest resistance, the first word of complaint, to be repressed, fined, vilified, harassed, hunted down, abused, clubbed, disarmed, bound, choked, imprisoned, judged, condemned, shot, deported, sacrificed, sold, betrayed, and to crown all, mocked, ridiculed, derided, outraged, dishonored. That is government, that is its justice, that is its morality. General idea of the revolution in the 19th century. The Victorian philosopher Herbert Spencer queried whether man requires governments at all. He wrote, "What, then, do they, humans, want a government for? Not to regulate commerce, not to educate the people, not to teach religion, not to administer charity, not to make roads and railways, but simply to defend the natural rights of man, to protect person and property, to prevent the aggressions of the powerful upon the weak, in a word, to administer justice. This is the natural, the original, office of a government. It was not intended to do less, it ought not to be allowed to do more. The man versus the state." He also wrote, "The great political superstition of the past was the divine right of kings. The great political superstition of the present is the divine right of parliaments." The father of the anarchist movement, Mikhail Bakunin, who spent many years imprisoned in dungeons, knew all about government oppression. For him, governments were unnecessary institutions that darkened the world. The liberty of man consists solely in this, that he obeys the laws of nature, because he has himself recognized them as such, and not because they have been imposed upon him externally by any foreign will whatsoever, human or divine, collective or individual. God and the State, 1882. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood why governments exist, and how they maintain their malignant dominion. He wrote, "A fullness of state power such as only despotism had enjoyed, surpassed all the past because it strove for the formal annihilation of the individual. Once the earth is brought under all-embracing economic control, then mankind will find it has been reduced to machinery in its service, as a monstrous clockwork system of ever smaller, more finely adjusted wheels." Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset explained state corruption in these words: "This is the gravest danger that today threatens civilization, state intervention, the absorption of all spontaneous social effort by the state, that is to say, of spontaneous historical action, which in the long run sustains, nourishes and impels human destinies." His sentiments were shared by the American critic Henry L. Mencken, who said that the state has spread out its powers until they penetrate to every act of the citizen, however secret. It has begun to throw around its operations the high dignity and impeccability of a state religion. Its agents become a separate and superior caste, with authority to bind and loose. But it still remains, as it was in the beginning, the common enemy of all well-disposed, industrious and decent men. In his important book on state totalitarianism, entitled Our Enemy, the State, author Albert J. Nock explained the motives of state officials. "It is unfortunately none too well understood that, just as the state has no money of its own, so it has no power of its own. All power it has is what society gives it, plus what it confiscates from time to time on one pretext or another. There is no other source from which state power can be drawn. Therefore every assumption of state power, whether by gift or seizure, leaves society with so much less power. There is never, nor can be, any strengthening of state power without a corresponding and roughly equivalent depletion of social power." Nock understands that there is not a jot of difference between American Federalists and the diabolical fascists who have plagued the world. He put the matter plainly: the superficial distinctions of fascism, Bolshevism, Hitlerism, are the concern of journalists and publicists. The serious student sees in them only one root idea of a complete conversion of social power to state power. The positive testimony of history is that the state invariably had its origin in conquest and confiscation. No known state known to history originated in any other manner. The men who profited from the Constitution's acceptance, expertly used fear to further their interests and to goad delegates into compliance with their will. They manipulated the fact that Americans were traumatized and exhausted by war. They stage-managed the conventions and controlled media reportage of events in Virginia and Philadelphia. Had the people time to relax and educate themselves, if they had paid attention to the warnings of Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, and the many other critics who suspected what the conspirators were planning, the Constitution would never have been ratified. Instead, the best that the people were able to belatedly receive, after the fact, was the Bill of Rights drafted in 1791. It was expressly created to protect people against potential abuses of the ill-received Constitution. It was conceded to the American people by Madison, who by then had secured all that he and his Federalist colleagues had demanded. A number of states had accepted the Constitution with urgent recommendations for changes. At first, it seemed that Congress would pay no attention to these suggestions. Patrick Henry and others then set up a clamor which had to be heeded, and Congress referred the proposals to a committee, Nevins and Commanger, Pocket History of the U.S. The Federalists delayed ratification of the Bill of Rights for over 2 years while they organized the new federal courts and armed the judges with powers to counter individual rights. Kenneth W. Royce, Hologram of Liberty. The Federalists instigated virtual panic, and made sure the people were not able to take enough time to repair and think. Their representatives and delegates were harried into accepting and signing the Constitution. The same methods of conflict control have been used over the generations. They are still being put to good use by politicians and parties. In the 1960s, ex-communist Jerry Kirk discovered the way the great game is played. He eloquently explained the process in these words: the idea is to create a situation where the people are so frightened of the chaos all around them, that they will throw their arms up in the air and shout, "Federal government, do something." And the only choice open will be martial law. The communists, black militants and revolutionaries will never succeed in overthrowing the government of the United States, but unless they are stopped, they will scare the American people into accepting socialism from Washington, and status rule from the establishment. This is what it is really all about. Freedom can go to hell, but apparently silly belief systems and prejudices are always welcome to stay. Expert on the British takeover of America, G. Edward Griffin, delineates the phenomena of conflict control, in these words: deliberately create problems, and then offer only those solutions which result in the expansion of government. Create conditions so frightful at home and abroad that the abandonment of personal liberties and national sovereignty will appear as a reasonable price for a return to domestic tranquility and world peace. The Capitalist Conspiracy. James S. Coonan, a student revolutionary, also discovered how the upper echelon conspires to foment social unrest, so that the true enemies of freedom can remain undetected. He wrote, "In the evening we went up to the university to check out a strategy meeting. A kid was giving a report on the SDS convention. He said that, at the convention, men from Business International roundtables tried to buy up a few radicals. These men are the world's leading industrialists, and they convene to decide how our lives are going to go. These are the guys who wrote the Alliance for Progress. They are the left wing of the ruling class. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago, L 968. We were offered SO Rockefeller money. They want us to make a lot of radical commotion so they can look more in the center as they move to the left." The Strawberry Statement, Notes of a College Revolutionary. The scrapping of the U.S. Constitution is essential. Americans must revise and update the Articles of Confederation, and subsequently abolish the corrupt federal, totalitarian apparatus of control. Americans must wake up from their delirium and find out what kind of conspiracy has been occurring in their land. They must contemplate the words of Bertrand de Juvenal, who said, "A society of sheep must in time beget a government of wolves," and remember that it was mutineers and not conformists who founded America. The traitors are still with us. Indeed, their treachery is greater than ever. Hiding behind the Constitution and political process, they see to it that America's ports are sold and that schools are swamped and underfunded. Because of their scandalous policies, America's heavy industry operates at a minimum. American businesses are throttled by legality and taxation, while foreign-made products fill the shelves. Companies and jobs are perpetually outsourced, prisons supersize while innocent men and women languish behind bars to be raped and tortured. Poisons fall from the sky in the form of chemtrails, and illegal aliens occupy like invading armies, enjoying the fruits they did nothing to cultivate or harvest. And it all occurs in a country that came out of World War II richer than it went in. Why is this? What has happened? Why have so few taken so much from so many for so long? As of 2000, USA Today reports on its front page that 6.6 million adults, 3% of the adult population, are in prison or correction. No other society has ever done so deadly a thing to its people and on such a scale. Gore Vidal, Imperial America. People should not be afraid of their governments, governments should be afraid of the people. We have 2 million people in jail. Our country doesn't build hospitals, doesn't build schools and doesn't build daycare centers. It builds prisons. This is not the hallmark of a free society, but of a police state. Stephen Hager, High Times editor-in-chief. The Oriental countries prosper and rise economically. The Third World is fast becoming the First World, while the First World nosedives into ruin. This was the plan from the start. It is the result of tyranny, not democracy. It is also the result of apathy. No truer words on the subject were stated than these by President Abraham Lincoln: "These United States of America can never be destroyed from forces outside its borders. If America falls, it will fall from within. Brought down by apathy. When good people do nothing, anarchy reigns." Letter to Congress, 1854. Lincoln also emphasized the despotism of the wealthy oligarchs who prosper from the ignorance and apathy of the masses. Their profile and resume was well known to him. The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than a monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. Robert Maynard Hutchins also commented on the apathetic state brought on by overstimulation and trauma. The death of democracy is not likely to be an assassination from ambush. It will be a slow extinction from apathy, indifference, and undernourishment. George W. Malone, a senator from Nevada, made the following statement before Congress in 1957: "I believe that if the people of this nation fully understood what Congress has done to them over the last 49 years, they would move on Washington, they would not wait for an election. It adds up to a preconceived plan to destroy the economic and social independence of the United States." Ironically, during and after the War of Independence, the eyes of the world were on America. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas Romanov II, admired what he saw taking place and, before his brutal assassination, he was ready to emulate the scintillating American experiment. During the War of Independence, he sent ships, money, and troops to assist the American rebels. Russia, and many other countries, would have changed for the better had Americans not been cajoled into adopting the Constitution and, as a result, not fallen under the control of avaricious despots. The good news is that even the most oppressive tyranny cannot last forever. Once the tyrant and his heinous industry is exposed, the game is up. At that point they can be overthrown, and things can be put aright. It has happened in Ireland and the Congo, in Cuba and Nicaragua, and many other lands. But the enemy knows this only too well. He understands that he is vulnerable, and is aware of how he could be undermined. As a result, he is constantly on guard. He knows that his activities and methods must not be properly scrutinized. Consequently, he makes a point of keeping his subjects in fear for their lives. He prefers them to be limbic creatures unable to reason and discern good from bad and right from wrong. He makes sure their attention is focused elsewhere, and that strange, demented, and frightening enemies are always rattling the gates. Through his obedient agents, he funds and controls the supposed enemies, and instructs them how to operate. In this manner is the great game of geopolitics and mass control played. It is simply chess on a global level. Should a pawn fall off the board, or be sacrificed, the kings, queens, and bishops do not turn a hair. The comfortably placed, ruthless misleaders bang the drums of war and send dedicated men and women to fight and die for the United States Corporation. The US is a business, and those who have given their lives for it, died uselessly. Sadly, and tragically, they have been sacrificed at the behest of their country's true enemies. As Count Leo Tolstoy wrote, government is an association of men who do violence to the rest of us. George William Frederick, George III, King of Great Britain and Hanover. He was a member of the Hanover dynasty, the so-called House of Orange. Like numerous royals, he was a demented maniac who suffered from mental disease. According to author George Trevelyan, he vowed never to acknowledge the independence of the Americans, and to punish their contumacy by the indefinite prolongation of a war which promised to be eternal. He wanted to keep the rebels harassed, anxious, and poor, until the day when, by a natural and inevitable process, discontent and disappointment were converted into penitence and remorse. Military men are dumb, stupid animals, to be used as pawns for foreign policy. Henry Kissinger, January to February 2003 edition of Eagle newsletter. It's not a number I'm terribly interested in, Colin Powell reply when asked about the Iraqi casualties. George William Frederick, George III, King of Great Britain and Hanover. He was a member of the Hanover dynasty, the so-called House of Orange. Like numerous royals, he was a demented maniac who suffered from mental disease. According to author George Trevelyan, he vowed never to acknowledge the independence of the Americans, and to punish their contumacy by the indefinite prolongation of a war which promised to be eternal. He wanted to keep the rebels harassed, anxious, and poor, until the day when, by a natural and inevitable process, discontent and disappointment were converted into penitence and remorse. The men who committed this atrocity in New York, on September 11, 2001, mass murdered more people than the combined killings of every serial killer in the 228-year history of the United States. Anthony J. Hilder, The Greatest Lie Ever Sold. Our point is simple. We insist that the predators and parasites, who have vampired America and the world, must be closely studied. Understanding how and why they function as they do provides humankind with the keys of worldly salvation. Our point is simple. We insist that the predators and parasites, who have vampired America and the world, must be closely studied. Understanding how and why they function as they do provides humankind with the keys of worldly salvation. Moreover, we must understand that the despots of the world are creatures of habit. They enjoy repetition, and their nefarious strategies are tried and true. Additionally, we need to understand that despots bank on one human weakness, that of forgetfulness. Historical amnesia hands them the power they covet. As author Milan Kundera so appropriately said, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. The answer to humankind's future lies in remembering what has transpired in history. It lies in not repeating past mistakes, and not falling for the same tired political fallacies. Furthermore, we must end our psychological dependence on the fiends who have established despotic forms of government and who benefit from our allegiance. As long as we consciously or unconsciously identify with the predator, we will never see the demise of tyranny, regardless of the political action taken. It will raise its ugly head time and time again. Ultimately, we must judge our misleaders by their deeds and not by their words. We must be on guard against their rhetoric and sophistry, and not hesitate to use existing laws to prevent them doing their worst. We must not be afraid to seek justice when degenerate, self-serving politicians, supposedly acting in our name, seek to lead us astray. Civil disobedience is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is that numbers of people all over the world have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their government and have gone to war, and millions have been killed because of this obedience. Our problem is that people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty and starvation and stupidity, and war, and cruelty. Our problem is that people are obedient while the jails are full of petty thieves, and all the while the grand thieves are running the country. That's our problem. Howard Zinn. President Andrew Jackson suffered terribly at the hands of the brutes of the British Crown. During the war he and his brother were captured, held prisoner, and nearly starved to death. When Andrew refused to clean the boots of a redcoat, he was slashed at with a sword which left him with scars on his left hand and head. His brother Robert died from smallpox contracted while under British captivity. Jackson's immediate family died from war-related hardships. As a result of his horrific experiences, Andrew Jackson never forgave the British oppressors. The Articles of Confederation worked to bring security to all Americans. They restored order after the chaos of the War of Independence. Unlike the U.S. Constitution, the Articles of Confederation honored the rights of individual states. The Articles did not distinguish between rich and poor. They were meant for citizens, not people. They did not permit an oligarchy to assume totalitarian control. The men who drafted and ratified the U.S. Constitution were hungry for power over human beings. They adamantly wanted to protect their own prestige and wealth. Despite their megalomania, they knew exactly what they wanted and how to go about getting it. They acted like proverbial wolves in sheep's clothing. Their constitution is likewise largely deceptive in form and substance. It allowed for an aristocracy to preside in America. The American-based aristocrats may not wear crowns or sit on thrones, but they are, in many cases, directly connected to the royal dynasties of Britain and Europe. George W. Bush is, for example, a distant cousin of John Kerry, the presidential nominee who ran against him in 2004. Kerry's parents was not Irish, but Jewish. On the matter of his aristocratic ancestry, we read, Senator John Kerry has blue blood from all the royal houses of Europe, with even more titled relations than President Bush. Burke's Peerage, which researches the genealogy, said the Democratic presidential candidate traces descent through his mother, Rosemary Forbes, to the royal houses of Albania, England, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Russia, Byzantium, Persia, Iran, and France. Forbes was descended from William Forbes, the Laird of New, an extended family that included many baronets. It is via this family that the Democratic candidate is descended from Henry II, the King of England and father of Richard the Lionheart, who was the leader of the Third Crusade in 1189. By contrast, Bush is related to Queen Elizabeth II, 20 British dukes and many European princes. President Bush, Princess Diana and Winston Churchill are distantly related. Union Jack newspaper, September 2000 edition. Americans don't care about politics, only about politicians. Anthony Wedgwood Benn. George H. W. Bush and his wife Barbara are related to the same British oligarchs. George is also closely related to every European monarch on and off the throne, and has kinship with every member of Britain's royal family, the House of Windsor. He is the 13th cousin of Britain's Queen Mother, and of her daughter Queen Elizabeth, and is the 13th cousin once removed of the heir to the throne, Prince Charles. Bush's family tree can be documented as far back as the early 15th century. He has a direct descent from Henry III and from Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor, who was also the wife of Louis XI of France. He is also descended from Charles II of England, David Icke, Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center disaster. Father George and wife Barbara are both descendants of Godefroy de Bouillon who, in 1099, led European noblemen in the successful crusade to recapture Jerusalem from the Islamic faith and moved into the king's palace at Temple Mount. Godefroy de Bouillon was the first king of Jerusalem and the Duke of Lower Lorraine, a major region for the Illuminati bloodline, but the time has come for the veils of mystique to be torn away from the so-called fathers of the Constitution. They were not champions of a free, sovereign nation, and their legacy is neither auspicious nor grand. They chose to subvert the articles that guaranteed freedom to every American. They coveted power and wealth, and made themselves fabulously rich by exploiting the gullibility and ignorance of the moral, but illiterate, masses. In our time, their villainous counterparts in government have shifted into overdrive. Their heinous acts of conquest, extortion, and confiscation know no bounds. As long as ignorance of the enemy's nature persists, nothing will change, and the pirates of Capitol Hill will continue to ply their insidious trade. As King George once demanded, the war against America was to be waged eternally. His desire is being fulfilled as every day passes. Unless the Machiavellian intrigues of his biological and ideological descendants are exposed and overcome, America's ruin is certain. The task is, however, impossible without knowledge of the adversary. Knowledge is the weapon we must use to eradicate the imperious predators that lurk behind the long grass. Conspiracy. One of the darkest words in the language of man. Yet there is hardly a single page of history that does not partially reveal the deadly eye of conspiracy at work. It was a conspiracy that led Brutus against Caesar in the Roman Senate on the Ides of March, that plotted the betrayal of West Point by Benedict Arnold during the American Revolution, that led John Wilkes Booth to the assassination of President Lincoln on Good Friday 1865. The past record of man is burdened with accounts of assassinations, secret combines, palace plots and betrayals in war. But in spite of this clear record, an amazing number of people have begun to scoff at the possibility of conspiracy at work today. They dismiss such an idea merely as a conspiratorial view. G. Edward Griffin, The Capitalist Conspiracy. Knowledge of the enemy is the golden key that opens the gate to a future free of tyranny and slavery. We not only owe our children a better and freer future, we owe it to our forebears. Those who fought and labored to create the elements of civilization that we enjoy, but who were treacherously undermined and robbed, must be remembered and reverently toasted. It is their memory we must honor, not that of their destroyers. Where other men have skimmed the surface, Beard has gone through to the core. He stayed months in Washington to get to the core. In his search for ancient papers and documents in the Treasury Department, he went into vaults that were so filled with dust that it was necessary to excavate the papers with a vacuum cleaner. But when he came back to the surface, he had damning evidence against a good many of the Patriot Fathers. He then knew why they were so anxious, not only for a new constitution, but for the particular kind of a constitution that was afterward adopted. Alan L. Benson, The Dishonest Constitution. By Michael Zarian.